when I travel. Anybody familiar with Bring Fido? It's like TripAdvisor for people with dogs. You can go online and find dog-friendly hotels and restaurants and things to do. And Albie and I relied on it quite a bit in our own travels. You know, Steinbeck didn't have the luxury of going online to find a dog-friendly motel when he needed one. So I just want to introduce you to Albie. Isn't he beautiful? I just love this dog. And it's hard for me to talk about him without being emotional. In 2012, early 2012, Albie was found wandering alone, scared, hungry, quite thin, on a street in rural Louisiana. And he's one of the hundreds of thousands of dogs in this country who, through no fault of their own, the lost, the abandoned, the abused, and the neglected, who find themselves in shelters in this country every year. And Albie was brought to the shelter that serves the parish where Alexandria sits in central Louisiana. It serves a small community, but they take in about 5,000 dogs every year, and 90% of them will never leave, and they won't last probably more than a week or two. Albie survived for 5 months in that shelter. I'll say more about that in a couple of minutes. So he was a real underdog. He had to beat incredible odds to stay alive there and stay alive long enough until someone, and it turned out to be us, came along and stepped up for him and adopted him. So he's a very lucky dog. But we, my family, we feel so lucky that he came into our lives. And knowing what fate awaited Albie if someone hadn't stepped up for him has made that relationship that we have with him all the more poignant. After we adopted Albie, and by the way, I had no idea why we had so many dogs coming up to this area from the south. I didn't know why we were adopting a dog from Louisiana. I had no idea of the scope of the problem, which is quite extensive in this country. But my curiosity about that situation led me to write the book on the left called Rescue Road. The one man of the subtitle is a remarkable guy from Ohio who drives a big rig twice a month from Ohio to the Gulf Coast and up to the Northeast with about 60 to 80 dogs like Albie on every trip. Over 8,000 miles every month for over 10 years he's done this. But he was my entryway into this whole world of people who do this incredible work down south. And I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them later on, but people who make second chances for dogs like Albie possible. And so that book was really about the whole problem that exists in this country, particularly in the South, of overpopulation, and all the people, not just Greg, who drives the dogs north, but all the people on the ground in places like Texas, Louisiana, and Tennessee, who save these dogs and give them a second chance. After that book, I wrote another book about rescue dogs, but this was more about what it's like once they are in our homes, you know, and the joys of giving these dogs a second chance. After I wrote the first book, my email box started to fill up with pictures like this. People started sending me pictures of their dogs with the book, and on Facebook. And you can see, you know, the guy on the left fell asleep reading it, but that's okay. But this is my favorite one of all that I got in the mail. So, you know, everybody's a critic. Anyway, and what I like about this picture in particular is this dog has no remorse at all for what he's done. So, as I mentioned, I reread Travels with Charlie a couple of years ago when I was 63. And Steinbeck, when he took his trip with Charlie in 1960, was 58 years old. And he took the trip because he said he was an American writer writing about America, and he felt he had lost touch with the country. And he wanted to go out and meet people and just feel America one more time. But he was also quite aware that he had entered the later years of his life, and he felt that, you know, if he didn't do it now, when would he ever do it? And that's something that really resonated for me, because my own relationship with my own mortality is sort of described in this picture. I'm always thinking about the fact that, you know, time, especially as I was approaching the age where I was going to get my Medicare card, I started to realize, you know, this isn't going to go on forever, and I better do it while we can. Albie, when we adopted him in 2012, was estimated to be 2 or 3 years old. So by the time we took this trip in 2018, he had aged, he was about my age biologically, because dogs age faster. And so here we were on the cusp of old age together. And I thought, you know, if we don't seize the moment now, who knows if we'll ever get another chance. And that's what launched this trip. Now, why travel with a dog? And Steinbeck really explained it perfectly. A dog is a bond between strangers. And he talks about how all the conversations that he had with people along the way often began with people asking him what kind of dog Charlie was. And this absolutely proved to be the case on our trip. Dogs are a social lubricant. You know, I wanted to talk to people, but it's a little awkward to just go up to strangers and, you know, say, I'd like to talk to you. But you travel with a dog, it's a totally different experience. Everybody wants to meet the dog. How old is he? What's his name? Can I pet him? And so on. So Albie really did exactly what I hoped he would do on this trip. So in April, it was April of last year that we left. We were here about to get in the car. You know, you realize I can't explain to Albie that we're not just going to CVS, you know, that we're not going to not be home in half an hour. He has no idea he's about to be taken away from everything he knows for 6 weeks for this long trip. So this was just as we were about to leave Dover, where we live now. When we pack for a trip like this, or any trip that we take, we pack our clothes, we pack our toiletries. If you're my age, you pack your medications. But there's something else we all pack when we travel, and it doesn't weigh anything. You can't see it, and TSA at the airport will not ask you about it. And what we take with us are stereotypes and preconceptions about people. In this case, people in other parts of the country. And it's just good to be mindful of those preconceptions when you travel. You know, my image of the American South was sort of forged in the 1960s with the assassination of Martin Luther King and the murder of the 3 civil rights workers and you know, the riots of the 60s. So my impression of the South were formed in that era. And I had to be very aware of that and just be prepared when you travel to have those preconceptions over, you know, in some cases blown to bits, and in some cases maybe affirmed. But it's good to be aware of them. Steinbeck traveled at the dawn of the interstate highway system. And he wrote that when we get these throughways across the whole country, you'll be able to drive from New York to California and not see anything. So taking that cue, I mapped out a route, more or less one that followed Steinbeck's route, not exactly, but that we tried to make most of our trip on secondary roads. You can't learn anything about America on Route 80 in Ohio. You're not going to learn in Nevada, wherever you are. You got to get off the main highway to really have the experience. So we traveled in the spring. He traveled in the fall. He went counterclockwise around, and we went clockwise around the country. The idea was not to recreate Steinbeck's trip. You know, he traveled camper with a manual typewriter and carbon paper and the old maps that we used to, you know, open up and could never get back together again. I had my maps in my phone. Take notes on my phone. I had a phone in my phone. You could, you know, it took the place of a lot of what he traveled with. So we weren't out to recreate his trip. It was a touchstone for our trip. The other thing, Steinbeck was worried because he was already a famous writer that he might be recognized wherever he went. And to say the least, that was not a concern of mine. My first question as we left Boston was, when would I feel like we had reached another part of the country? When would I feel like we were no longer kind of home? You know, you remember in The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy says to Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. When would I have that moment? And it turned out, my first question was, when would we feel like we were in the South? So you can drive from the southern edge of Pennsylvania, which we all agree is a northern state, to the northern edge of Virginia in 35 to 40 minutes. But I definitely felt that we had reached the South. One reason, it was not dinosaurs, but one reason was at this point, I looked up and the highway sign was so we were on the Patsy Cline Highway. Patsy Cline was a country western singer. And I thought, boy, I don't think you could find a road in the Northeast named for a country western singer. And then we got 10 miles further south, and there was a truck in a parking lot with a bumper sticker that said, American by birth, Southern by the grace of God. And that's when I realized we had reached the South. That was in the town of Front Royal, Virginia, which some of you may know is the National Park. And we drove that whole parkway. I was so excited to be out on the road in this convertible we had, but that day in April on the Skyline Drive, it was 27 degrees. So we couldn't put the top down. But when we finally got to the end of Skyline Drive, which is where you pick up the Blue Ridge Parkway, which runs for almost 500 miles through Virginia and North Carolina, through the mountains, we finally hit warmer weather and could put the top down. And I'm showing you this picture for two reasons. One is because I think it's really cute. And the second one is I just want you to notice that Albie's sitting on this car seat cover that hooks behind the headrest and then covers the back, and then he can lie on top of it. And that'll become relevant in a moment. Once we got down to the end of the Blue Ridge Parkway near Asheville, we were headed west into Tennessee, all the way to Nashville, where we were going to pick up another wonderful parkway, the Natchez Trace Parkway. But I had chosen to go into from North Carolina into Tennessee on US 129 in a section called Deal's Gap. This is a famous road called the Tail of the Dragon. It's got 318 curves packed into 11 mountain miles. And once you start, you can't get off. And what makes it so harrowing is that it's an attraction for everyone with a motorcycle or a fast car and a death wish, and they're all here to test their driving skills. And I had a group of motorcycles like that 6 inches off my bumper, and it's like it finally found a little place to pull off to let them go by. It's very dangerous. It was very harrowing. I was sorry we did it. And when we got to the bottom in the valley and the road flattened out, I took a deep breath and I sort of pulled my fingers off the wheel and turned around to see how Albie was doing. And he was doing great. He had a fantastic time on this road. And what he had done, and he often did this when the top was down and it was cold, he had worked his way behind the car to make him feel secure. And it also made him feel warm when we were in colder weather with the top down. As we drove down the Natchez Trace Parkway, which is easy driving and beautiful, 444 miles, all the way from Nashville to Natchez, our night on that highway, we pulled off and stayed in Tupelo, Elvis Presley's hometown. And I picked this restaurant at random called Vanelli's to get a bite to eat. And as we approached the restaurant, we saw these two fellas sitting out front. And the guy on the right turned out to be an incredible character. It turns out he's the owner of Vanelli's restaurant. His name is Vaz Vanelli. It's a nickname. But in any event, he was out there, and this was one of the really great spirits we met on the trip. First of all, he's a self-described progressive living in the most conservative corner of one of the most conservative states in the country. But everybody seemed to know him and love him, and it was clear why. He stood outside on the sidewalk on Saturday night. There wasn't anybody who walked by that didn't get a hug or a handshake or a kid. He had lollipops in his pockets for the kids. He was just this incredibly gregarious spirit. He would grab family and get a picture taken. He was just a complete character. And he invited us to stay at his house, which we couldn't do because he had cats, as it turned out. But we had been there about we ended up spending the whole night talking to him. After we'd been there only about a half an hour, he popped up and he just sang this little impromptu song, which we'll play a little bit for you.
He's on his way across the USA. Well, he never told me his name, and if he did, I forgot. But he seems like a fella that's really full of it. Full of what? He's got the stuff. Yeah. He's got the good stuff.
Anyway, what I him, we spent the evening talking. One of the things he said to me is the reason he does what he does out on Main Street is they say, I can't change the world, but I can bring a little moment of happiness to everyone who passes by. And I really left feeling like this is one of the reasons we travel, is to meet people like this, totally unexpected, chance meeting that really was really quite joyful. From Tupelo, we were on our way to New Orleans. New Orleans played a very important role in Travels with Charlie. I won't go into it, but too much. But Steinbeck witnessed some pretty ugly racism in New Orleans. They were integrating the schools for the first time there, and it really ruined the trip for him. And he just made a beeline for home. But I love New Orleans. My son went to college there. He still lives there. I think it's the most distinctive, unique city in the country, and I love going there. And we went to see my son, spend a couple of days, and the night before we left, I started to feel a little bit anxious. And why did I feel anxious? Because we were going from here to Alexandria, Louisiana, where Albie had been found, and because I wanted him to have a reunion with the two women who saved his life. And it turned out it worked for all of us to meet, because Krista's a volunteer at the shelter where Albie was outside of the shelter. And I had been to this shelter when I was writing my first book about rescue dogs, and it's a pretty grim place. And I really worried that Albie would think he might have some memory of this place and think maybe I was bringing him back. We project a lot of these feelings onto our dogs. It turns out he didn't seem to have any recollection of this place or of Krista and Kerry, but I wanted them to have a chance, because they're the kind of people I wrote about in that first book, who sacrifice their time, their money, and see a lot of suffering, a lot of death, and for every happy ending like Albie's, there are hundreds that don't have happy endings. And I just thought it would be really nice for them to see him after all these years. Kerry on the left was our adoption coordinator with a group called Labs for Rescue, which is based in Connecticut, was the group that we adopted Albie through. But it was Krista who just took a shine to Albie, and every week she went to the shelter director and begged for another week for him for 5 months. And that's how he managed to survive. So this was really one of the most meaningful little stops on our trip, was to see them again. From here, we were going to I didn't have many places I was determined to go on this trip, but one of them was Okemah, Oklahoma. And you might wonder why, but the clue is in the picture. It's the hometown of Woody Guthrie. It's where Woody Guthrie was born and spent his childhood. And for the same reasons that I always loved Steinbeck as a writer, I always loved Guthrie as a musician, because he really sang for the marginalized, poor, dispossessed, powerless people in our society. And so he was kind of my hero since I was a child, and I wanted to go to Okemah and see his birthplace. Steinbeck and Woody Guthrie actually their lives. Steinbeck was the great chronicler of the Dust Bowl in prose and Grapes of Wrath. And Woody Guthrie was the great chronicler of the Dust Bowl in music. When Grapes of Wrath was made into a movie in 1940 with Henry Fonda, Woody Guthrie was in New York recording an album for Victor Records. And they thought they could capitalize on the popularity of the film by having Guthrie write songs about the Dust Bowl. He was the obvious person to do it. He had come from Oklahoma during the Depression. And it resulted in an album called the Dust Bowl Ballads. And John Steinbeck once quipped to his son that he wished that Guthrie had written those songs earlier, because it would have saved him the trouble of writing the Grapes of Wrath. Okemah, Oklahoma, very conservative town in a conservative state. It took them decades after Woody Guthrie's death to finally embrace the Woody Guthrie's legacy. In 1967, the year that he died, a town father named Earl Walker wanted to create a memorial to Guthrie. He thought it would be a good tourist attraction, and he felt the town should honor Guthrie. And it was met with stiff resistance because of Guthrie's left-wing politics. And as the generations passed, it was finally in 1997, 30 years later, that the town finally kind of really wrapped its arms around the Guthrie legacy, created a music festival called Woody Fest, which happens every year now in July. So that's part of the Guthrie history in Okemah. But Okemah was interesting also for another reason. It's very emblematic of towns in the heartland of America that have really fallen on hard times. When the interstate came through, it diverted traffic around town, and then when Walmart came in, it killed all the retail. And it's a pretty down and out place. It's a shell of its former self. By sheer luck, the day we arrived in Okemah, there was a festival going on in town that coincided with the high school class reunions of 68 to 72, exactly my age group. So there were a lot of people home from elsewhere on the street, partaking of this festival, which meant that we met a lot of people that day. And it turned out to be one of the best days of the trip. Many people I met in town commented on how disappointing Okemah had become. The vibrant town of their youth didn't exist anymore. And everybody had a little bit of a story to tell about themselves or about their family connection to the Guthries. Lance Warren on the told me how his dad used to shoot marbles with Woody Guthrie in the lot across the street. Wayland Bishop, sort of the unofficial historian. But everybody was introducing us to other people, and everybody was they expressed such gratitude that we had even bothered to come and that we were interested in their town. And what I realized is that in these sort of more forgotten places in America, to tell some story is to not be forgotten or forsaken. And before we knew it, the word seemed to have spread around town that we were there. And this woman came up to me. She said, "Are you the guy from Boston?" Because she had heard there was a guy with a dog from Boston or whatever. She told me her granddaughter teaches at MIT. She was very proud of that. And then she told me about her childhood in Okemah and that she and her older brother, she's now 90, play music at the Woody Fest at the open mic they have every year. And as she said goodbye, she walked about 10 feet. And then she turned around. She said, "Thank you so much for coming to Okemah, and please come back." And I just realized, people didn't care where I was from or what what I thought about politics. They were just grateful and warm, and it was really quite an eye-opener. And it became even more so through Curtis Walker, whose grandfather was Earl, the one that first wanted to commemorate Guthrie. We had been talking on and off all day, and he's an Iraq war vet. He's in the Army Reserve, born in Okemah, grew up there. And he told me after the parade that he would walk me over to the property his grandfather had bought, which now belonged to him, where the Guthrie childhood home used to stand. You can see a sculpture, you can't see it all, but it says, "This land is your land," and there's some musical notes, and there's more stuff on the back commemorating Woody Guthrie. And so we've been talking on and off all day. And as we walked over to the property, it was the first moment we had alone at all. And he kind of leaned over to me and he said something that took me aback. He said, "I'm like the gay black man in this town." I'm like, wow, that's really, I thought to myself, this is very strange. I don't know where this is going. And then he said to me, "I'm a liberal." And what I realized, two things. I had sort of made assumptions about him based on where he grew up. He was an Iraq war vet. He had made assumptions about me traveling around the country in my little convertible with my dog. And he was right and I was wrong. And he was very happy to have someone else to talk to about politics. But he said, "My politics don't matter to people here. I grew up here. They all know me." And then he took me out to an outdoor bar to buy me a beer, which he insisted. I wanted to buy him beer. He said, "It doesn't work that way around here." And he introduced me to the owners of the bar, who had bought it a couple of years before. And it was clear that they were a gay couple, two men. And when I had a chance, I said to Curtis, "What kind of reception have they gotten in Okemah, knowing how conservative is he?" He said, "Everybody loves them. They're the greatest guys, and nobody cares." And I thought, these are some of these preconceptions that I traveled with to a town like Okemah that were being overturned. by the people that I met. So, we make these assumptions about parts of the country. They're not always true. Once we left Okima, headed west, we were now back on Steinbeck. We had diverged from it somewhat, and we were going to be following all the way to California, pretty much the route that the Dust Bowl refugees all took to go to California in the Depression, including the Jodes. And what I'm referring to is that we were paralleling or sometimes on old Route 66, famous highway, probably the most famous road that ever existed in America, except maybe the New Jersey Turnpike. But it ran from Chicago to Santa Monica. Steinbeck called it the Mother Road in The Grapes of Wrath. You can't drive all of Route 66 anymore. It's not a contiguous road. It's not part of the federal highway system anymore. There are remnants of it. It's pretty much been replaced by I-40. But when you pull off into towns like Tucumcari and you're on the main street, you're on the old Route 66. And it's worth going to some of these towns just for the artwork. Every town was filled with these great sort of retro murals that were really wonderful to look at. It was in New Mexico, and I use this picture to illustrate this next little story. Albie and I had been together every mile, every minute, but it dawned on me in New Mexico that we were not on the same trip. And what do I mean by that? We had arrived in Santa Fe, and we were staying up in the hills in an inn, and it was about 11 at night, and I was pretty ready to go to sleep, but I thought, I think Albie needs to go out one more time. So we walked out, and I looked across the valley at the mountain range that runs north-south along the eastern side of Santa Fe. And I thought there was a little bit of tiny faint white light, very dim. I didn't know what it was, and I looked around, the moon hadn't risen. I thought, I wonder if the moon's going to rise. I wonder if that's the moon. And if you've been to Santa Fe or in the high on a beautiful night. And so the light started to get brighter and brighter, and sure enough, it's just broke over the mountains. And you know how when you see the moon or the sun rise or set right at the horizon, it looks like it's moving, because you just can see it, come into view. And what you're seeing, of course, is the rotation of the Earth, bringing it into view. And I'm absolutely spellbound. It's magnificent. And I'm in this sort of quasi-spiritual reverie. And I look over, and Albie's facing the other way. He's not looking at the moonrise. And not only that, I couldn't interest him in the moonrise. He wouldn't even turn around to look at it. And it dawned on me that he didn't care. In 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, we weren't going to be looking at pictures of this trip and reminiscing about it. He was experiencing this whole thing in a very different way than I was. He was enjoying the smells. He was enjoying squirrels where he could find them. But I realized he's not exactly taking the same trip. And when we got to the Grand Canyon, one of the places I really longed to see after 50 years, the weather was pretty bad. It was still busy in late April. And we got there, we got up to the edge of the canyon. I'd driven all this way, and the fog was so thick you couldn't see 2 feet into the Grand Canyon. And it was snow all over the ground. And I said to Albie, we're going to wait. And we're going to wait as long as it takes, but we've got to wait, got to catch a break and see it. So we walked for a couple of hours through the slush. He was happy. He loved the snow. He likes to eat snow. There were squirrels. There were pinyon pines for him to sniff. But after a couple of hours, we finally got our break. And he was no more interested in the Grand Canyon than he was, frankly, in the moonrise. But if you've been to Grand Canyon, static, the view. The weather was so wild, it's not capturing it here, but curtains of fog would run through the canyon, and then it would snow, and it was quite wild and quite spectacular. We finally reached the other side of the continent at Half Moon Bay, California, having driven up the Central Valley of California, which was Steinbeck's home ground. He was from Salinas. And if you're ever in the Bay Area, it's worth taking the hour drive and going to Salinas, visit the National Steinbeck Center. It's a fabulous place. So we had finally reached the other side of the continent. And from here on, I'm going to skip a lot in the interest of time. We the very northeast section of California, which is not very heavily visited by tourists, but it's absolutely spectacular. And then across the eastern half of Oregon, which is as empty and desolate a part of America I've ever seen. And then into Boise, Idaho. And since we're in Wayland, I should tell this story. We were driving across Idaho on a route number 20 and stopped in the town of Peekaboo. You remember the Olympic skier, Peekaboo Street? That's where she's from. And there's a general store there, kind of a hunting, fishing supply store where Hemingway used to buy all of his gear when he was out in Idaho. And I was talking to this guy behind the counter about our trip. And I said we were on our way back to Boston, and he threw me a curveball. He said, "Are you taking 20 all the way?" And I didn't realize it's the same Route 20 that runs from Kenmore Square to Newport, Oregon, as it turns out. And I think it might even run right here. It runs right here through Wayland. It's the same road. It's the longest highway in America. So I didn't realize that. I knew there was a Route 20 around here, and out in Lenox I was familiar with it, but I didn't know we were on that road. So we went to Yellowstone and then to North Dakota. One of the most interesting characters we met on this trip. I went in, we were now on the interstate. I ran into a Starbucks in Bismarck to get something for the road. But as I approached the front, I saw this bicycle and this trailer with stuff. Looked like somebody on quite a trek. And on the back, in marker, was written, "Traveling veteran, anything helps." And I thought, this is going to be a really interesting story to talk to whoever belongs together with this bicycle. And I went in and met this guy, Lewis. It wasn't hard to figure out who it was that was connected to this bicycle. A tough as nails former Marine. And I said, "How long have you been?" I said, "What prompted you to make this trip?" Again, he was on his own search for America. He had had an experience. He was in a coffee shop in Florida, waiting in line, and there was a soldier in uniform in front of him who had been in Afghanistan, apparently. And the barista, they got into an argument somehow about what he had done in Afghanistan. And Lewis said to me, I wanted to reach across the counter and throttle her. And so I decided then I was going to ride my bike around America to find out if Americans were still patriotic. That was his mission. I said, "Well, what are you finding? Are you encouraged?" And he said he was. And I asked him for some examples. And he told me a story about being in Texas, stopped to help some elderly guy who was having trouble using a chainsaw. And as they got to talking, the guy asked Lewis if he'd be interested in hanging around and meeting up with a militia, an armed militia that this guy was part of, with 32,000 members. And Lewis said, "You mean 32,000 in Texas?" And he said, "No, 32,000 of us in these 3 counties here." I was horrified, inside. He thought this was great. This was his, this told him that, Americans were still patriotic. But the point is that we ended up talking for at least an hour. And, I shared my views on these things, and he told me his. And we couldn't have been more on opposite ends of the political spectrum. But we had a very cordial conversation. I liked him. He was curious about our trip. He wanted to come out to the car and meet Albie. And I realized that when we get out from behind our computers and talk to one another face to face, it's a little harder to be as judgmental as we sometimes are. I mean, this is a very difficult time in the country. We're very fractured and divided. But across 9,200 miles, we didn't have a single negative encounter. There's still a big reservoir of common decency out there, and we found it everywhere that we went, and we really need to work to make sure we don't lose it. I'm going to jump way ahead and tell you that we spent the last night on the road in Bennington, Vermont. And we could have made it home that night, and we were gone already 6 weeks, and I think with the other dogs, and I was ready to be home. But we had made a promise that we had to keep. The first week on the road in Tennessee, I got a phone call from an old family friend of my parents, who was then 94, a woman named Winnie Mason. And she and my mother had grown up together in Brookline and were friends. And our families were very close. I mean, so close that I always knew growing up that if something happened to my parents, we would go to live with these people, Winnie and her husband, Paul Mason. So these people have meant a lot in my life. And I promised Winnie on the phone, she didn't know we were on the trip. I told her what we were doing. And it occurred to me then that the perfect way to end this trip would be to see them. And, you know, they were, as I said, 94 and 99 at that point. And so we drove from Bennington to where they live year-round now in Agunquit, Maine, now at 100 and 95 respectively. And this is a town that had a lot of meaning in my life because we used to spend every summer vacation visiting them and renting a cottage here. I learned to ride a bicycle about 100 yards from that spot. And it was the first neighborhood that my brother and I were allowed to kind of wander freely by ourselves, or order, you know, you may remember there was, not until last year, there was a bar right there. We used to go by ourselves and order food and went to the movies by ourselves. So it's a place I really grew up. So before we had our visit with Winnie and Paul, I wanted to take Albie to see some of the sights. We were a little bit frustrated to find out we couldn't walk the bridge. Albie thought the sign was hilarious, as you can see. And I had, you know, we used to catch crabs off this bridge, and I was about to chance it, and somebody came along and said, you know what, they are so strict, you're gonna get ticketed. So we didn't. So anyway, so we had our visit with Winnie and Paul. Let me see, I'm gonna find this. And then it was time to go home. And I'm just gonna read you the last few paragraphs. I don't usually like to read from the book because you can tell I don't sound like James Earl Jones, and so I can't make it quite as dramatic, but I think it's the best way to sort of bring it to a close. So it was this was after our visit now. I said it was nearing 6 p.m., and we had an hour and a half to Perkins Cove. I'm sure many of you know it. To and from the sea. A narrow little peninsula, not even 100 yards wide in some places, separates the cove from the ocean. I took a seat on a bench overlooking the ocean side. You may know this view. Albie is always close by my side. The evening was warm, the light was golden, and the ocean unusually calm. How many times had I sat in this very spot and watched the ocean lap up against these craggy rocks? And then I looked down at Albie, and every time I think I couldn't love him any more than I do, I do. As we soaked up the view and took in this serene evening, my mind wandered back across the decades and over the past 6 weeks. We had more than 9,000 miles behind us and just 90 to go. I had nearly 65 years behind me and an unknown number, but far fewer to go. And Albie, too, now about 9, was closer to the end than the beginning. All of these journeys were slowly ebbing away. Then Judy called, that's my wife, snapping my attention back to the present, and suddenly all the miles and all the powerful memories stirred up by the day caught up with me. I wanted to lie down and take a long nap. As I started to tell Judy where we were, my voice cracked and my tears welled up in my eyes. So much of my life had passed, some of the best of it right here at this very spot, and others nearby. I felt grief for my parents, for all the time that had now passed, and for innocence lost. On those summer evenings in Agunquit long ago, my parents were less than half the age I was now. So much in life had changed, so much had happened since the days when as children we spent our summer vacations here. But the view, it hadn't changed at all. Albie, dear sweet earnest Albie, sat quietly by me for about another half hour before I mustered the energy to stand up and ready myself for the drive home. I gave him a long, long hug and thanked him for being with me, for being so patient over so many miles that were no doubt far more interesting for me than they were for him. This gentle old soul once lost in the woods of central Louisiana, and now part of who I am and will forever be. An enormous surge of gratitude that fate had brought us together washed over me. And then we walked over to the takeout window at Barnacle Billy's, and I bought him a vanilla ice cream cone. And that's how the travelers came home again. So thank you for listening. If you've read Travels with Charlie, you may recognize that that last line is also the last line in Travels with Charlie, which I borrowed. Anybody have a question? Somebody must have a question.
What did you use as a camera?
My cell phone, my iPhone. And actually, you know, these cameras have gotten so good that the cover photo in the book is a picture I took with my iPhone. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Anyone else? Any questions? Yes?
How was it traveling with him? I mean, did you have to make more frequent stops than you might have, or
You know, I think
fine in the backseat?
I actually think he got tired of me stopping all the time because I explained this in the beginning of the book. You know, if you want to meet people and have a spontaneous conversation and an open conversation, don't notebook and take out a tape recorder. So very often I found myself having these conversations and trying to keep them in my head. And then at the first opportunity, we get back in the car and I would write down everything I could remember. Or thoughts would occur to me as we drove, things we were seeing. So I was forever pulling off into parking lots or the side of the road to make notes. He was absolutely perfect travel companion. Better behaved on the road than he often is at home. I think because all his familiar reference points had disappeared and I was sort of it. Yeah, you know, it was just like living with a dog. I mean, his comfort was my first concern. It's one of the reasons we traveled south first in the spring, because I wanted the chances that the weather would be as cool as possible for as much of the trip as possible, because I knew there might be times I have to run into a store or run in to use a bathroom, and he's going to be in the car, and you know, if it was too hot, I would never leave him in the car. But that factored into a lot of things, because when we left Grand Canyon, even though it was snowing there, I looked ahead to where we were going to be driving across the Mojave Desert in a couple of days, and the forecast was like for a high of 114 for like 10 days straight. And I was really concerned, what if we had a break? What if a flat tire? Or something goes, he's not even going to be able to step out of the car. So we had to kind of readjust our schedule that way. But I was always really thinking about, you know, making sure he was comfortable. He just never seemed to complain. He was just so pliable. It was really quite nice. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back there.
So were there a lot of other traveling dogs on your journey?
Did we meet other traveling dogs? We met a lot of people. Actually, it's funny you should ask. We were on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and a car pulled in with California plates, and this couple was on their way around the country from California, and they immediately took to Albie because the guy pulled out his phone right away. Yellow lab that looks a lot like Albie, but they weren't traveling with him. And then another car, as we were talking, another car pulled in from Maine, and they were doing the same thing, driving around, and they had a rescue dog, all three of us, and we all had a lot to talk about. But we didn't meet a lot of people. I can't think of anyone we met traveling around the country with their dog. But I know a lot of people do it. And someone asked me in one of my talks, would it have been different would it have been a different experience if it was like my wife and I traveling with the dog? I thought, absolutely. When you're traveling as a couple, you're not as approachable by strangers. You know, people think you're into your own thing. I don't think we would have, had so many of the kind of chance encounters that I was hoping to have if we were traveling more as a family, so to speak. So, but I can't think of any dogs that we met that were making a similar trip. I mean, I heard a lot of stories about people would tell me about trips they'd made with their dogs. So Bring Fido was great for that. It's a great resource because I could find out what restaurants were, look online and see whether they welcome dogs or would say, dogs welcome on the patio or whatever. So that was really helpful. There were a few places, like in the Bay Area and then in Boise, stayed with family. In Boise, I actually stayed with a second cousin I had never met before. but we had connected on Facebook years ago, and they have 2 dogs, and so there's a little bit of respite from the loneliness of the road. I mean, after a week of checking into a different motel every night, it began to feel like we were on the lam, there for a while, and then it would be nice to New Orleans, see my son, but we didn't see anybody else. Okay, from the time we left New Orleans to the time we arrived in the Bay Area, it was a couple of weeks, we didn't see a single human being we'd ever seen before, which is, you start to feel like you're really out there. But it's good. I wanted to shake up my routine. That was part of the goal. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts of doing something similar, another trip with Albie?
Good question. I don't think we could have made the trip this year because he's got arthritis and it's gotten worse. And I don't think it would have been so easy for him to make the trip this year. So to the point I made early on about seizing the moment, I'm glad we seized it when we did. After discovering that Route 20 in Idaho was the same Route 20 that comes through Wayland, I did get the idea that I wanted to do that trip all the way from Kenmore Square to Oregon, with or without a dog, just because I thought it would be so interesting to do another road trip. I tell people, we left before the Boston Marathon of 2018. If we had waited one day, we could have had an entirely different trip. The weather might have been different in places. We would have met a different cast of characters. Every trip is so idiosyncratic, So even if I took the same route again, it would be a different trip. But I would be interested in driving Route 20 all the way. I think that would be really interesting. There is a group that formed out in sort of central Mass that's trying to get a designation all the way across the United States of historic Route 20, and they've got a logo and everything. And even though these are federally recognized highways, it doesn't mean they're federally maintained. Some places they're state maintained, sometimes it's even town by town or county by county. So they've got to work with dozens and dozens of jurisdictions to get this road marked, this historic 20, all the way across the United States. Kim?
You noted 2 things that were sort of complementary and contradictory at the same time, which were friendly and kind. Wherever you went, you didn't have any incidents, people were kind, but also that that when you're in densely populated places where people are in proximity of other people who are different than them, they tend to be more tolerant, and it's a little bit of a contradiction in a way because you're finding people are kind everywhere, but at the same time they don't really know people who are different than them. And I wonder what's
Right. Look, if I had been African American, would I have would have been as easy to travel in some of the places where we were? When we were on the Blue Ridge Parkway, there are these gates that, in the winter, they use them to close off parts of the parkway. And I didn't know why, but we got to one point on the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, and the gate was drawn across the road with no explanation. I found out later when I went online that that was a section that was closed for maintenance. And the cell reception wasn't good enough, so my Google Maps didn't work. So we kind of had to navigate down towards Asheville. So for a couple of hours, we were on really back roads in North Carolina. And to be honest, partially because of the stereotypes I have, I didn't feel comfortable, in this little sporty car with my Massachusetts plates and all that. Not that we didn't have, nothing happened, but I was very much aware of that. But, I thought about what you just mentioned. In eastern Oregon, we were in a little town called Burns, which you may remember because, remember the Bundy brothers took over a federal wildlife refuge in Oregon a couple years ago? The nearest town to that refuge is Burns. And it's very remote and it's very tiny. And just to give you a sense of the scale, the county, Harney County, Oregon, is about the same size as Massachusetts. And we have 7 million people here. Harney County has 7,000 people in the entire county. And 5,000 of them live in two towns that are right next to each other that comprise 4 square miles. And, you know, it's almost exclusively white, and 7,000 people in an area the size of Massachusetts. And so there's not a lot of cross-pollination of culture or any of that. And so it's a very different existence, very different world. It's especially for an Easterner as you travel in the West, we're not used to this kind of distance between human habitation. You can drive 100 miles out there, and the only sign of human presence is the road you're on, and maybe an occasional fence or, something. It's incredible how remote parts of the country are. I don't know if that speaks to your question, but
I guess what I was really wondering was if you heard or saw anything that gave you hope.
hope? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the comment, like I said, the fact that wherever we went, people were so kind. In Tupelo, we were in a coffee shop, and I asked if Albie could have a cup of whipped cream. And we took a seat outside, and when they brought it out, it had 3 strips of bacon on it. That was just a little act of kindness that, someone just said, oh, that'd be nice. It's a nice thing to do. And the couple who owned the bed and breakfast we stayed in near Yosemite, we were the only guests that night. They invited us to have dinner with them. They made food for about 20 people. It was just the 3 of us and Albie. They wanted Albie to come and, join us. And then the next day we went up to Yosemite. They had packed a lunch and just handed it to me as we took off. I mean, just those little acts of kindness that I think do cross political lines. Most people I found would want to be kind. That was our experience, despite all the fractures that we see all around us. Well, thank you all for coming. Haley Booksellers is here. They've got all 3 of the dog books it's a good holiday gifts or whatever, but they have the new one and the 2 other ones about dogs. So thank you all for your attention.